Our next speaker is Haniel. Haniel, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Perfect. Right on time.
Yep.
So, so I wanted to take and introduce Haniel. Haniel is Associate Director and Power Platform Practice Lead at ProTVT. Uh, he's a familiar face when you visit any Microsoft conference here or around the world. He's very active in a community and always ready to help. Uh, h- like he's very passionate about sharing his knowledge and giving back to the community. So thank you, Haniel, for being part of our event and sharing your expertise with everybody who is participating in this event. And floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. Just one thing. Can you let me present? Can you make me presenter?
Sorry.
No worries. I know it's a new feature, and a lot of times people forget to do that.
Okay, you are now.
Perfect. All right. So good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Z Haniel Croitoru. I'm going to be talking about Power Platform Assessment today. It's going to be a very fast-paced presentation. I'm going to be going through a lot of material. Just stick around. If there's any questions, feel free to connect afterwards or post questions to the chat. I'm actually going to keep the chat window open next to me so I can see any conversation. Awesome. All right. So first of all, big shout out to Microsoft and Evolvus for promoting and sponsoring the event. As many of you know, these kind of events are not possible without sponsorship. It takes a lot of effort. You know, we've got all these great volunteers, Vivek and Ashraf and many others helping out. But sometimes funding is required, and so shout out to those sponsors. So as Vivek mentioned, my name is Z Haniel Croitoru. I'm an associate director working at Protiviti. I also lead the global Power Platform practice. I'm involved in engagements literally around the world when it comes to the Power Platform. I'm a 5 times Microsoft MVP in the business application space. Actually, there's a URL at the bottom. So if you want to learn more about the type of assessments that we do, I urge you to check it out. I'm also going to be showing it to you towards the end of the session. So we talk a lot about automation. The whole conference is about automation. And what COVID has actually done, it has accelerated the amount of automation that's happening, and it created a novelty to a necessity for a lot of organizations today. People are remote, access to paper is not there, approvals, a lot of these processes that you were able to do them in a somewhat automated way in an office, all of a sudden people are distributed around the world or not in the same building or in the same office. It's much more difficult. And so automation has become a necessity today. Now, I'm curious to know if your organization is using Power Platform today. I did a survey recently around organizations who are managing the Power Platform, and I said, okay, is it IT who's managing it? Is it business? Is there a dedicated team, or is nobody managing it? And so if I'm going to ask the people on the call right now to guess what percentage of companies actually don't have active management of Power Platform, what would you say? So take a moment to post your answers in the chat, and I'll be right back. %70%, okay? Anybody else? 50%, all right. Give it a couple of more seconds. 60%. Okay, so fortunately, it's not that high. It is, though, pretty high still. 30% of companies out there are not actively managing the Power Platform. They think of it as, you know what, it's a low-code platform, low-code solutions. let the citizen developers thrive, right? Let them build their solutions and let them do what they want to do to become more efficient. Well, those who are, comic fans know the famous line when it comes to, with great power comes great responsibility, right? Well, same holds true for the Power Platform. I mean, it puts a lot of abilities in the user's hands. Just think about it. You can build a workflow that could literally cripple your entire organization if it's not properly managed. You can build power apps that expose a lot of data. And there's a lot of elements that go into it. And so when we talk about governance, a lot of times companies and people shy away like, oh, there's governance is this big manual, this big book of things we have to read and follow. But in reality, governance means risk mitigation and risk avoidance for companies. And it's not that employees are naturally bad or malicious. It's a very honest mistake that somebody makes that could have a huge impact. Imagine somebody who wants to build a simple workflow that will, archive some old documents or delete some old documents from a SharePoint site. What if they make a small mistake in their workflow and they actually impact all the SharePoint sites that they have access to, or, delete way more files than they're intending? So there could be huge repercussions if things are not properly managed or governed. And so the key components we're looking at here is Power Apps, Power Automate, which includes the cloud as well as the desktop version. Power BI, not so much because that's more of the client of the data we are using, although it's still something that needs to be governed directly or indirectly. Power Virtual Agents, again, they're consuming a lot of information, a lot of data, but you want to be able to track them. And Dataverse, where a lot of the data is going to live. With that, there's other auxiliary components, such as your connector or custom connectors, your on-premise gateways. So there's different elements that you want to think about. Now, when you're talking about governance in the Power Platform, it's not a one step where you just say, okay, we're going to roll out governance, we're done. Typically, what you're going to do, and the reality is with organizations who are just adopting the Power Platform, is that you start with an assessment, right? What's the current state? Some organizations that I work with, they say, oh, nobody's really using the Power Platform. And I say, really? Let me run a simple assessment for you. And I find that there's hundreds of workflows and Power Apps and gateways, and the next reaction from IT is, oh my God, we had no idea. Okay, how do we bring things under control? Because things are obviously off the rails. So that's the first step you want to be doing, is some sort of an assessment. Now, it doesn't mean that you do an assessment one time. Assessment is something that you want to be doing on an ongoing basis, because things are going to change, requirements are going to change, a lot of things in the landscape will change over time. New functionality, for example. So you start with the assessment. The next step is phase one, which is where you're actually building a governance strategy. The people, the processes, the procedures, any sort of systems, any sort of steps you want to take, things to watch out for, all of that has to be documented. And it's not documented one time, it's not documented and has to be reviewed. Then we have phase two, which is a governance deployment. So this is where you're actually rolling out the governance, but also facilitating governance through automation. So for example, by default, somebody can go in, a user, and create their own environments. You don't want that because there's cost and there's many other implications. So you can build governance to say, okay, there's going to be an approval process. There has to be some sort of a cost recovery for IT based on the department that needs the environment. So there's multiple elements. But rather than having to follow a bunch of steps or just issue a ticket to IT to do everything manually, you can actually build automation to say, okay, what's this? Have a simple form, ask a few questions, go through the approvals automatically using the Power Platform, and once everything is done, go and provision the environment, assign the access, assign any sort of licenses, do all of those things on the back end using automation itself. That's phase two. And then the last phase is phase three, which is really the optimization. This is where organizations are using the Power Platform. They have a governance in place. They are reviewing it on a regular basis, but they're also now taking on the ownership of understanding how our solution is going to be built. and doing more of that nurturing and the training and the knowledge transfer so that everybody essentially is on board at the same level. So that's, if you want to think of it as a governance program that you go to from start to finish. And again, it's something that is cyclical. You want to do that on a periodic basis, review that everything's up to date. Now, I call the session Power Platform Assessment from A to Z. It's actually almost A to Z. It's A to X. There's a couple of things I didn't get in there just because I really couldn't find something with a Y or with a Z. So pardon me for the inaccuracy here. I'm going to go in alphabetic order. Obviously, I'm going to be jumping around because depending on what you're talking about, depending on the letter it falls on the alphabet, it's going to be in different places. The point is that I want you to start thinking about governance and Power Platform governance and Power Platform assessments as not just, is my flow okay? Are my licenses up to date? And even if you're using the Power Platform Center of Excellence, that gives you good information, but don't just blindly trust the tool. You really want to make sure that you have a solid understanding of what's happening under the hood. So let's get going. So apps. You start doing an assessment, you get an inventory of all of the apps across the organization. And what you might find is there's a lot of apps. Some of them have the word test in them. It's not clear what they are, there's no description. So you want to ask yourself when you do an assessment, what are the apps for? Who's using them? How were they built? Are they following any sort of guidelines? What kind of an experience do they have, right? Were they built for mobile and are they being used on a desktop? Not ideal. Were they designed in a landscape environment and are actually run on a mobile device? Not a good scenario either. What kind of data is being accessed? How is it being accessed? Who has access to it? So there's a lot of questions you're going to ask yourself when it comes to the apps, okay? Bots, and specifically when I talk about bots, I'm talking about the Power Automate desktop bots that we can build, the RPA bots. So while there's a lot of constraints you can add to the cloud, once somebody starts building these Power Automate desktop, bots, there's less control you have because somebody's running something on their personal machine. Granted, it's an organizational machine. You can do remote mobile management. You can put certain restrictions. But once they've got the Power Automate for desktop installed, they can start actually running these kind of automations. What you can do is restrict it, especially if it's going to be called from the cloud. What kind of bots are going to be built? What kind of accounts can be used with them? What kind of configurations they can have? And you can do a lot of that through the registry. And that can not necessarily eliminate any sort of risk, but it can certainly reduce the amount of things that could go wrong, right? So if you're saying, okay, I'm going to block users from going to a certain service, then if you're not allowing the bot to access a certain organizational account, the user won't be able to do that. Custom connectors. So similar scenario where there's a piece of custom code that's going to be running somewhere in another environment. It could be in Azure of your tenant. It could be in another Azure environment. It could be different places. The idea behind the custom connector is that it is helping you solve a problem or retrieve data and manage your data because there's nothing out of the box available. So there's hundreds of connectors available in the Power Platform by default, but you may have a legacy system, or maybe it's a system that was custom built for your needs and you want to build some automation into it. And so when you have custom connectors, get an inventory, find out who built them, do an audit and a review of them. Make sure that if there's any changes being introduced to the code that runs behind the scene, that it is properly tracked to make sure that nothing is being added or put in there that breaks your processes. Data loss prevention. So this one's really important. You should be looking at having data loss prevention policies. That's one way to make sure that data is not going to be used incorrectly or inadvertently, leaving your organization. At the same time, you got to be careful. If you're adding these kind of policies to a live environment, have you actually assessed to make sure that you're not breaking something? So the Center of Excellence is really good to let you know if you're going to be rolling out a policy, which workflows are going to be affected, because that happens immediately. If it's a Power App, once you republish it, it's going to give you an issue. And so I've actually worked with clients where they said, oh, we heard about data loss and it's really, really important. We're going to turn on a whole bunch of data loss prevention policies. And the next day they were flooded with emails from all users saying everything's broken because you've just limited the functionality. So it's really important to understand what are the capabilities of data loss prevention and how it's being rolled out, right? It's great, but you got to make sure that you're doing it the right way. Environments. And so environments is a way to encapsulate your different components from the Power Platform. Power Apps, flows, dashboards, environment variables, and other types of components. You can set up environments in different regions. In fact, you must select the region when you're setting it up. Now, if you are a multi or international organization with different offices, you got to consider, where does the data reside? So, for example, if you have users who are in Europe, there are GDPR laws that you must follow. If you're in US, there's SOX. There's different types of laws you must abide to. If somebody's just going to go and create an environment and they just pick the default region and you start storing data there, your company may be open to a lawsuit. And this actually happened in a very, very large online organization. They were fined over $800 million for having collected information about employees against government laws. Okay, so you got to be really careful about it. Again, it may be completely inadvertent, but if the data is being stored in the wrong location and used in the wrong way, and you don't know about it, you can find yourself in deep water. So you want to be careful about that. And so the whole environment rollout, as I said before, you want to make sure that it's properly done. You want to make sure that people are aware, what are the environments, who's going to be using them, where's the data, all of that entire environment lifecycle. Failures. Failures are inevitable. They will happen, guaranteed 100%. You can have failures in your Power App, in your Power Automate workflows, desktop, connections, Dataverse can have issues with some data, right? So there's all of these errors you can have. Make sure that you're tracking them. By default, if a workflow fails, you're not going to find out right away that it failed. It might be a day later or so when you get an email. The owner of that flow will get an email saying this flow has failed 15 times. But what if it's a mission critical workflow? You want to make sure that you're capturing these kind of errors immediately. You want to make sure that you're addressing them. Better yet, you want to make sure that you're actually building fault tolerance so that you can deal with them without actually impacting something. So an example I like to give is, imagine you have a workflow where you're going to be modifying some information in SharePoint, and then based on that, you're going to go and modify other data in another system. Let's say that the first few steps have worked and your SharePoint part is done, it updated information, and then you hit a failure. Do you rerun the same workflow? If yes, you're actually updating your SharePoint data a second time. So all of a sudden you're in this non-deterministic state of your different data sources. And so ideally what you want to do with failures is catch them early on, do as much checking as possible to make sure that, yes, for all of the steps below, I have the data, it is valid, right format, I'm good to go. Okay. Governing body. So this is where you want to make sure you have an actual group of individuals who will be supporting the Power Platform and everything around it. So typically the governing body is broken down into two groups. You have your tactical team and you have your strategic team. The tactical team will have an operations committee. Those are the people who keep the lights on. They make sure that people have the right licenses. They want to make sure that, if there's any additional capacity that's required, day-to-day activities for maintenance. For support, if, for example, a user has issues, there's failures that they're seeing, they have a support committee to go to. Or maybe they're doing some development and they just need some guidance. Again, they can go to the support committee. And then you have your strategic committee, and this is where business users and IT get together on a regular basis and say, okay, what are we doing with the Power Platform? Is it serving our needs? Is there something more we're trying to do? What do we need from the Power Platform team? And so together, this whole governing body should be meeting on a regular basis, review what's being done, and build on it. So HTTP triggers. So for those who are building workflows, it's a great trigger. Basically, what it means is that you can create a workflow that can be called from anywhere to do some processing of your data. It's good and it's bad in the same way. By default, the HTTP triggers have no security associated with them. In other words, anybody who has a URL to that workflow can call it. Now, if it's a workflow that returns data without any authentication or any checking, you're actually creating a data loss right there. And so a way to remediate that, there's actually two ways. One of them is you have some sort of a secret token that lives inside of the workflow, and you can pass it as a parameter, and it does a check to see if they are equal or not. A better way to do it is using something like Azure API management to make sure that when that workflow is being called, it is only being called from a certain network or a certain domain. If it doesn't go through. I for integrations. So as I said before, there are hundreds of different systems and connectors out there. So besides using your Microsoft stack, you might want to connect to Salesforce. You might want to connect to, for example, for data conversion to Codian or some other systems. The systems may be completely legitimate, the services, the companies. However, if you as a Power Platform developer or user want to access them, you need to understand that every one of those companies have their own terms and conditions. And even though they are legit, you got to make sure that your company is approving the use of a third party. Because what you're actually doing is you're taking data from your organization, from your tenant, and you're exfiltrating. You're sending it to another location. Maybe completely legit, but if we're in Canada, we may be accessing a service that's in Europe, or maybe in Eastern Europe, or maybe in the US, or some other location where the company may say we cannot send our data there. So because of that, purely because of the data residency, we cannot use that service. We have to use another service. Maybe we have to build something custom, right? So again, things you want to think about when you start to assess your Power Platform. JSON constraining. So when you're building workflows, there's a number of actions like parse JSON, response, and other ones where you need to define the JSON schema. And there's this great button that says generate from sample. And so you can give us a JSON payload, you press the button, and what it does is it actually generates the whole schema for you. But you got to be careful because sometimes Power Automate doesn't know the real intention or the real format behind it. For example, if I give it the number 1, is it a number or is it a floating point that just in this particular sample there is no floating component, so it's just the 1. If I give it a value, a text value, does it mean that it's required or maybe it's optional, right? So those are things that when you're generating the schema directly from the sample, you need to review it. Typically, one thing I see is that it changes everything to required. Almost all the data that is being passed in is automatically marked as required. And so if you try to pass it another sample of JSON and something's not there, it's going to fail. Also, if you're working with workflows, Power Automate workflows that are passing data back to a Power App, if you ever try to associate a workflow and you get this big red error bar saying that there's a failure, sometimes the pure reason behind it is that the schema is having a lot of required fields and it's actually not available. And so by removing that restriction on the requirement, the required fields, it's actually going to allow it to be associated with a Power App. Knowledge base. So you should be developing a knowledge base for your users on how to use the Power Platform. You can reference the Microsoft data. There's a plethora of data available on the web, but you just want to make sure that when users are asking questions on how do I build something or what are the guidelines for my company, you want to make sure that you have a standard available to them and that's something that's being reviewed and maintained on a regular basis. All right. Licensing, this one is a really big conversation. You can probably spend hours just talking about licensing. But at the bottom line is, do you have enough licenses? Do you have the right licenses? Do you have too many licenses? And so based on the specific applications that are being built, and by applications, I mean workflows and Power Apps and Power BI dashboards, virtual agents, any sort of RPA, are you using AI builder capabilities, right? So this will vary from company to company, from department to department, right? The needs will vary. you should never be in a case where you say, okay, everybody's going to get the same licenses, because you may be throwing a lot of money down the drain. So you just want to make sure you're reviewing your licensing on a regular basis to make sure that you're paying just enough. Don't overpay, obviously don't underpay, and make sure that when you're building your solution, this is really important. When you're building your solution, make sure that you're following the correct rules. Don't try to build a solution where you're trying to circumvent licensing through technology. That is something called multiplexing, which goes against the spirit of the Microsoft licensing. So in other words, if you are trying to use something in Dataverse, and Dataverse is a premium connector, and all your users would have to have premium, having your data sent to SharePoint and then having a workflow that takes the data from SharePoint and sends it into Dataverse is multiplexing, right? So you're not allowed to do that. So just be really careful when you're reviewing the solutions that you're building, that you're not in that situation. Managing solutions. So solutions is also a way to package. So I talked about environments, which are location-based. Environments can have multiple solutions. They can have workflows. They can have different elements. Solutions is a way to package also these elements and move them from one environment to another. So this is where you can have, again, Dataverse components and Power Apps and environment variables and flows and all that fun stuff. What you have to look at is how are things actually being passed between environments. So when you start a new solution, you start with a key component or system components that are managed, and you get those for free from Microsoft. Then you start building your managed elements on top of it. So you build solution A, and that's version 1. And then you start doing some patching, 1.1, 1.02, 1.03, keep patching. And eventually you say, you know what, we've taken all the patches, let's roll them up together into a new release, call it release 2. When you take that packaging, that solution, and you give it to another environment, so imagine you're in a dev environment building out a solution. When you're giving it to another environment for testing or directly into production, you should be passing it down as managed, because that means that users cannot modify what you've given them. You don't want them to modify. It's being developed, it's being tested and verified. Users typically will break stuff, right? So don't let them break it, give it to them in a managed solution. If they later on need to make some changes of their own and add to it, that becomes an unmanaged layer that they can then later on manage. Okay, so make sure that you're following kind of that bottom-up approach of take the system information, add your managed solution to it, and pass that over to the different environments to then consume it as it is, or if they need to make changes, include their unmanaged changes to it. Network privilege and location-based access. Again, I'm going alphabetically here. So when you're talking about how are your applications being used, you may want to limit what network they're accessed from, what devices they're accessed from, specific browsers. There's a lot of limitation that you can actually add into how it's being used. So for example, one recommendation is to use service accounts for a lot of the work. You may not want anybody to log in with a service account from outside of the network. So you may want to actually limit it and put some restrictions on it. Or you may not want anybody to go and make any sort of changes to flow when they're not inside your premise. So those are the kind of rules that you can build in using networks and privileges, least access and privilege in your environment. On-premise data gateways. So this is something that applies to Power Apps, Power Automate, Power BI. Users by default can go and create their on-premise gateways. They can connect to a bunch of data sources. And then those data sources can be used for Power Apps and Power Automate workflows. Now, you should ideally have a control over who's creating these data gateways, how are they being used, what data they're connecting to. And then today, there's no simple way to just get a query of, okay, what are the data gateways and how are they used? So what you actually need to do is you need to get a list of all the gateways. You can go to the Power Platform Admin Console. It gives it to you, but it only gives you very basic information. If you want to get more detailed, you need to actually use the Data Gateway PowerShell module, and you can get an export that gives you all the details, the IDs, the cluster ID, who's the owner, who are the users who have access to it. And then using that data, you can then also look at what are all of my connections, because Power Apps and Power Automate do not connect to a data gateway. They use a connection. The connection is what goes to the data gateway. And so what you can do is create an inventory of all of your connections, an inventory of all the gateways, figure out which gateway is used by which connection, and then go and check, well, which one of my workflows and which one of my Power Apps is actually using this connection. And that's how you can say, if I were to knock out one gateway, this one happens to be offline, I'm going to take it offline. What could I potentially break in the process of taking a gateway offline? Right? So you got to think about kind of taking that two-hop approach to inventory your data gateways. Something else that's important is, where are your gateways installed? Are they on somebody's laptop, or are they actually in a virtual machine or on a server, right? If it's something which is just for testing, it's okay to have it on somebody's laptop or desktop. But what if it's being used for some critical data, right? What if that laptop is being shut down for the weekend? You've just lost connectivity. Also, if it's being used for multiple applications, you don't want the gateway to be installed on the same machine as the SQL Server or a SharePoint farm, because if those services go down for maintenance, the gateway would go down with them. So what you want to do is you would actually install the gateway on a separate machine. Also, if it's mission critical, you should create a cluster. So you can have multiple gateways on different machines. If one goes down, it fails over to another gateway so that you're not actually losing connectivity to your services. So that's just to say that, you know, at the core, the gateways are very simple. There's not much to them, but you want to make sure that you're properly looking at how they're being set up and used in your environment. Provisioning, so we talked about it a little bit. So provisioning can be anything such as environments, workflows, licenses, user accounts, and you want to make sure that you have a process in place on what does it take to provision something, approvals, understanding of purpose, use, location, all that, and then revoking them or decommissioning these elements, so that you're not just creating it and 6 months down the road you're doing an assessment, you find that there's like hundreds of environments with capacity being used up, and you're paying extra user licenses that users have left the organization. So there's a lot of these elements. You just want to make sure that you're just doing a regular review of what has been provisioned and how things are being provisioned, so that you're not over provisioning in a sense. Queries. So when you're dealing with Power Automate and Power Apps, you want to consider certain limitations. With Power App, when it calls a Power Automate workflow, there's a two-minute limit. Losing my words here. So in other words, if you have a slow-running workflow, it's going to come back after 2 minutes. It's going to die. It's going to basically tell you, sorry, timed out, can't help you there. The other thing to consider is that there is a maximum by default 500, but you can up it to 2,000 items per gallery or per data source that you're bringing into Power Apps. So imagine you have a massive SharePoint list or other data source. What you should consider doing is actually filtering the data at the source before you're bringing it into your Power App, so that it doesn't time out, or so you're getting all the data that you're looking for. And then with Power Automate limits, you got to consider that there's also certain limitations on how many items are being accessed for Dataverse, for Excel, for a number of sources, and also the duration that these kind of workflows are running. So consider all these limitations when you're reviewing your solutions, when you're assessing them. And if you're finding that there is not necessarily failures, but clients are saying, I'm not getting all my data, or I get a blank screen when I'm waiting for data. Maybe it's timing out. Maybe it's bringing back the first, 2,000 items and not everything you're looking for. So things to consider. Roles. So with roles, we have a number of roles available. So we've got your global admin. That ideally should be used for provisioning access to users, but you don't want to be actively having your users using the global admin. So that should be minimized as much as possible. And so the next one down is going to be your Power Platform admin role. This allows you to manage all the different components in the Power Platform. Dynamics 365 service account, similar, has a bit less, but it's more geared towards the Dynamics platform. And then you have delegate admins, and those are ones, for example, if you're working with another company, you want them to do some work for you and help out, you can assign delegate admin permission to help you manage your Power Platform. Now, It's important to understand that these admin accounts, even though like the Power Platform admin can do everything in the environment, doesn't mean that inherently they have access to every element. So as an example, if you wanted to do a query of what are all the different workflows in the tenant, you can use the Power Platform admin to do that. You can actually run a workflow, or you can use some PowerShell to say, get me a list of all the environments, and then you iterate through your environments and you say, okay, now get me a list of all of my workflows. Simple to do. But if you want to go one level deeper and you want to say, okay, I actually want to know the content, I want to actually review the content of my workflows. The Power Platform admin by itself can't do that, because the way that it's set up is that to look at the content of a workflow or the history of the executions, you need to be an owner of the workflow. And so you can leverage the Power Platform admin account or role to get a list of the workflows, check for each workflow, am I an admin or an owner of that workflow? If I'm not, I add myself temporarily, I do whatever querying I have to do, and then I remove myself. So by default, it doesn't mean that Power Platform admin is going to give you everything you need, but it does enable you to get to it one way or another. And that, by the way, is something that you'll see in other services like SharePoint and other services in Microsoft. The similar approach is being used, is that the admin account doesn't simply just give you all the access, but it allows you to get to what you need to do. All right, moving along. Sharing is caring, except that you don't always want to be sharing everything. So when it comes to Power Apps and Power Automate, you share the app, you share the workflow, but it doesn't automatically share the data sources. So you got to consider that, because sometimes users are going to say, again, I get in a Power App, but I get nothing in it, or I get an error message saying, I don't have access to the data. So something you want to keep in mind when you're sharing. The other thing to consider is you may not want to be sharing. You want to actually block users from sharing. So as an example, let's say that you have your users building workflows, and Sally built a workflow that will basically take an email, and every time there's an attachment, it puts it into her OneDrive. And she thinks it's an awesome idea, and she's going to share it with everybody in the organization. Except what she doesn't realize is that rather than moving the attachments into her OneDrive, she's actually deleting it. And now she shared this workflow with everybody in the organization. Everybody's losing all of their attachments from the emails. Not a good idea. So this is an example where you may want to say, okay, I want to actually block users from sharing any workflows altogether. There's no mechanism built in today, but you can actually build something using the Microsoft 365 Security Center, where you have the unified audit logging. And you can actually track when is a workflow being shared or when is an app being shared. And based on that, you can actually trigger to find out who shared which workflow with whom, and then set up a workflow to actually go and remove that sharing ability that was just added. So a lot of flexibility available there. So you just want to make sure that you're tracking the sharing of apps and flows and everything that you're sharing very carefully. So technology debt. We are talking about low-code solution, and in many cases, it might be a really simple app or a simple workflow with a few actions. So not too much to it. But often what I've seen is you start with that, and you add another few features and another workflow and another component, and maybe some PCF in there and a dashboard, and let's put a bot on top of it. The next thing you know, you've got this massive solution that is being used across a large number of people, group of people, but nobody ever took a look at it. And it's just it becomes spaghetti code. You making production changes in production, and data is not being validated, and it becomes a mess. So what you want to make sure is that when you start building these solutions, you want to follow proper application lifecycle management processes, right? You don't want to end up with technology debt where things are just not designed the way they should. So you should have your developers working in a development environment, and everybody can get a development environment for free, right, with your tenant account. That should be reviewed, peer review, or maybe have IT or have a service available for your users where anybody who wants to build something on our platform, they should be encouraged to do so, but have another set of eyes, just take a look at it before it goes live. You can then have a test environment where you can put it in, validate it with the users. Once it's good, either it goes into another sandbox for UAT testing, or you can put it into production. But then if you need to change it, you don't just go make changes in production. It's one thing if it's like a hot fix or bad firefight, but in general, as you're rolling out more functionality and more features, you want to kind of go back to the beginning and redeploy the whole solution through that process. All right, user access. So basically, you've got your connections and you've got your data sources. And what you want to do, best practice, is limit the amount of data, limit the amount of access as much as possible. That is general best practice for any organization out there, right? Don't just give people data to play with or functionality that they really don't need. And so you want to limit the amount of connectors, you want to limit the amount of systems, and what you do is you end up in the bottom left corner for your citizen developers. These are the 23 connectors that they must have because you can't get away from it. They're probably going to be working in the default environment for personal productivity only, and that's a little playground. I don't call it sandbox, not to confuse you, but that's their playground. Now, there will be cases where you say, okay, you know what? I actually need to expose more systems, same connectors, but more access to systems for users. Imagine you have somebody who's working in the sales team. They need to consolidate data from not just one SharePoint site. They actually need to consolidate data across all the different regions, all the SharePoint sites, right? So that's a good indication of, okay, I need to give this particular user access to more data. They can pull their data, same connectors, and do their reporting or do the workflows, whatever they have to do. So this is where that specific user goes to the bottom right box, right? Same limitation of connectors, more data. Then we have situations where you want to still have very limited data, but you want to give access to more connectors. Example of that is marketing, right? So marketing will have their own SharePoint site, let's say, where they store all of their documents and all of their communications and everything else. But unlike the citizen developer or the core team that has only business connectors, the marketing team should have access to non-business connectors as well. Maybe Twitter, LinkedIn, some other social media, because they want to promote the company and they want to post some information out there. So they're the ones who are going to be on the top left with additional access to connectors. And then you have the top right, and this is essentially your IT department, or if there's a development team, and those are the ones who are building the enterprise-wide applications using the Power Platform for the greater company. Okay. Moving along, virtual agents. So with virtual agents, what you want to look at is, and with virtual agents, you can access data in workflows, right? You can pass data back and forth. There's the bot framework. So you want to check all the components, but also important is just how good are the bots? And so you want to review the analytics on a regular basis to look at, are they performing? How many calls are actually being escalated to a human, right? How many times is the chatbot just not being able to provide a decent answer? What's the general feedback? So looking at the Power Virtual Agents analytics is something that you also want to be doing as part of your assessment, because the chatbots are not cheap. They're expensive. They can be expensive, right? So you want to make sure that you get the most out of them. Workflows. Lots to be said about workflows. So again, when you do the inventory, how many workflows are there? What are they being used for? Who's using them? What kind of data is being accessed? How are they being shared? There's all of these questions that you want to ask yourself when you first do an assessment. And you say, oh, look, there's hundreds, right? You start with, okay, there's a whole bunch that have the word test in them. Do we really need them? Probably not, but verify. There's a whole bunch that are failing 100% of the time. Does the person know about that, right? Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe they created something and there's maybe another version of the same workflow that is succeeding, and there's another one that's just chewing up capacity or API calls, but it really doesn't do anything. Or worse, it's actually breaking something in the process that people are just not aware of, and down the road they're going to be like, oh my God, this thing has been running forever. We didn't know. Other workflows that are being suspended because of failures. So there's a lot of these things that you want to think about around the workflows. And then finally, exception handling. So you want to make sure that when you're building solutions, or when people in your organization are building solutions, they're following some sort of a process so that when failures happen, as I said earlier, failures will happen, you're actually capturing them properly. So in Power Automate, there's actually a way to capture, right? So when you see the little arrow here on the screen, that little red arrow, that's an indication of a failure, right? So, or that's an indication that this particular action is going to happen if a different condition happens. So if the try fails, and you want to make that almost a standard in your organization. So every workflow or every component that you build has some sort of fault tolerance to deal with it, because otherwise things are just going to fail, right? And you want to be able to respond, whether it's an escalation email, whether it's a notification, or maybe call another workflow to do something else. Like, there's a million things you can do with it, but you want to be able to capture that kind of data. Okay, so I know I went really, really fast. I could probably spend an hour on each one of those topics easily, but unfortunately, I'm close to running out of time. I have about 10 minutes left. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to open up the floor to any questions. I saw that there is some things going down the stream, so feel free to, I'm going to open it up the floor to questions now. Oops. All right, let's see here if there's any questions.
I don't see that many questions here, Daniel.
Okay.
But if anyone has a question, please unmute yourself. We still have 10 minutes left, so it is a good time to ask any question. He's a pro in Microsoft Power Platform application, so definitely, yeah, you can ask the question you're facing in your organization. So Sharon is asking, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just see here, Sharon, do you have a list of those 23 connectors? I do have it. If you want, I'm just trying to think. I don't have it actually in my deck here, but if you want to maybe send me a message, I can send you a list of those 23 connectors. Some of them you'll find you may actually be using. So for example, if anybody here is using SharePoint, and if you've ever seen the option today in the library where you can select the file and you can say request approval, that is actually using Power Automate behind the scene, right? So the approval workflow is one, or the approval connector is one of the 23. SharePoint, Outlook, OneDrive, Teams, those are a lot of the ones. There's the Office 365 one. These are all connectors that are part of those 23 that we're discussing here. But Sharon, if I'll be happy to follow up.
Okay.
Yes, I agree, Celia. A lot of companies should be looking at doing an assessment like this. It's interesting. I've had several companies where, like I said before, they said, "Oh, we don't need an assessment. We're not really running anything, and we have only 2 or 3 workflows, and everything is fine." It's like, well, you know that the moment you turn it on, everybody in the company can start building Power Apps and workflows and dashboards and things, right? And they can sign up for trial licenses if you don't turn it off, and they can create environments, and they can create on-premise gateways, and they can do all those things. And then usually it's like a blank stare, right? It's like, oh my God, I didn't know. And you do an assessment and you find that, yeah, people have actually been doing all those things. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And this is just purely talking from what I've been seeing in the last 6 months. A lot
And
of time.
it happens a lot of time with the companies. You know, they started with one of the Power Platform application, and then they move into, hey, there is a nice thing about Power App that we can do it.
Hmm.
Let's turn it on and do not monitor, because they never thought of implementing enterprise wide. They thought about implementing a department. Like, hey, one department is good,
Yeah,
they like it, let us give them power. And then people start creating different environments, there is no control. So definitely, like, you, before you start, this should be the first step.
yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing where you have people attending these kind of sessions where people are interested in technology, they want to learn, right? So they may be the ones, the citizen developer may be actually more educated than some IT departments where they're just looking at SharePoint, Azure, right? The big workloads that are being used on a day to day in the company. They don't think about this other thing that's available, super powerful, but they're like, yeah, we're probably not using it. We don't have to worry about it too much, right? And then they realize that the power users or the citizen developers are all of a sudden coming in equipped with knowledge and equipped with solutions to problems, and that's where now all of a sudden IT is behind the eight ball.
Yeah. So we have one comment from Zhang. Uh,
Yeah.
do you want to, like, unmute yourself and, like, in a short word, explain what was your experience? She is like, what was the experience overall involving moving environment from US to Canada?
Yeah, actually, we had this exact like you said. We had no any governance. We think no, we don't need to take care of it. We're not using it. But actually, we find out that when we assess it, we find out there's hundreds of flows and hundreds of apps already created by users.
Yeah.
And we said, no, we never assign license for them. But it turns out you don't need a license. People start to use trial license, and then I start to block the trial license. And then even you block the trial license, sign up, they still can use it because they have a SharePoint internal license.
Yeah.
And then they just create all the flows and connect it. And then we realize because our tenant is, we have the tenant right before Canadian have the Canadian data center. So
Yes.
that's why the default environment actually is provisioned in US, and all those apps and flows sits in the US. And we said no, that's definitely not allowed. It will cause problem, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
We will have a lawsuit. So we decided to do it, and it took me long time to plan it. And we send all the communication to users, see which I generate the list of all the apps and flows, and they say which one is business critical. And to our surprise, turns out quite a few apps and flows. They said, "Well, we are really depend on this flow, and one flow have like 2,000 users, and we can't afford the downtime even.
Yeah.
So we have to. So I basically create another production environment, help them to move those business critical flows and apps into that and non-default production environment, and then we can switch. It
Yeah.
took some effort.
Yeah, no, and this is Zhang. This is a great use case. You're sharing with us. Thank you so much. This what you're just giving is an example that I keep hearing again and again. And you've taken the right steps, moving it to the Canadian data center, moving the mission critical ones to a separate production environment. Those are things that is really important. Default people think it's a default, just start using it. In reality, when I go through these kind of assessments with clients, the first thing I tell them is rename the default to personal productivity so people realize it's not default just means use it. It means that it's not meant for production or enterprise level solution. It's only for my personal stuff. Like I said, if I want to build a simple workflow that will archive my emails, that's what the default environment should be. Nothing more complex. If it gets complex and shared, that should go into a production environment where you're properly governing it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing. And we renamed the production, the default environment called default and personal productivity. And another thing is because we don't have a premium license for users, basically I just use DLP, blocked all those premium license. That you don't want to people end up using those premium license. We find one group create some apps, and all the users sign up the trial license and start to use this premium connector. That turns out basically you violate the license, right? You shouldn't even, like you said, the skip that the license and use the trial, and then it turns out license expired, and they say, oh, our app is broken, and could you please fix it? And then they are using trial license to use the premium connector. That's caused all sorts of problems.
Now it's money. Yeah, now you have a cost on your hands that was not budgeted, was never approved, right? This is a really, really good example. Yeah, that's why you want to make sure. I mean, it may be legitimate, right? I mean, if you think about it, the time or the cost that the team is saving using those processes or the workflows may be legitimate and they may be justified, but they have to be properly managed and governed to say, okay, we're going to purchase Power App per app, or specific licenses, pay as you go licenses for those individuals just for that one app, because it's going to save them a lot of time and a lot of money and whatever the reason is. But it has to be justified. It has to be reviewed, right, to say that yes, it makes sense.
That's exactly what you talked about. The DLP kicks in. We are still try to set up a proper DLP strategy, which environment with what the PLC,
right.
Exactly like you talked about, some like default environment, the most strict, and then some like a more lenient. And also we find that environment management, I try to use some environment without Dataverse, but it turns out it's easier to manage without Dataverse because you only have two roles, admin and environment and app maker. It's much easier and quite straightforward. But when we start to use it, gradually I realize approval, although it's a standard connector, but it needs solution. And then the solution needs Dataverse.
Yes.
So until now, I'm still kind of curious. Is there any value to have an environment without Dataverse? Because if you don't have a Dataverse, then you cannot even use some standard license. I think Microsoft should be clear about that. And you don't want to have people, for certain embedded license holder, they don't need the premium license. They can do a lot of things, but at the same time, you kind of force me to provision the Dataverse on that environment. This is a little bit, I don't know how to deal with this kind of thing.
There are some scenarios today, and I just realized I have about 2 minutes left, Jan, but I know that there are some scenarios that, for example, you have to use the default environment. You can't get away from it. If you want to do a SharePoint workflow that triggers when you select the file and you want to do something, or when you select a list item, that has to run in the default environment. You can't get away from it. On-premise gateways are installed in the default environment. So there are some things that would still restrict you, but there's ways around it to limit what you can do or how you can deal with it, right? You can tell people, okay, not everybody, like even though it's in a default environment, the on-premise gateway, you block users from creating them. So they can, even though it's in default, you can only use gateways that are already available and that were assigned to you. So anyways, I wanna say again, thank you to everybody. If anybody wants to continue the conversation, afterwards, please reach out to me by email. Probably email is the best way. Be more than happy to continue and enjoy the rest of your day. Vivek?
Thank you, Haniel. Great session. I got some feedback as well. So for attendees, what I want to tell is next session is in room 1. It is Ask the Expert session, and after that session, you can come back to this room 2 and continue attending. So you can move to the next room 1 for next 1 hour. We have great session that are coming up in room 2. So do come back after 1 hour. Thank you.